So when we start Unit 1, we're starting with Chapter 4 of the textbook. And Chapter 4 is getting into biomechanics. And the biomechanics is looking at fundamental, so looking at how this skeleton represents itself in three-dimensional space and how we communicate that in two-dimensional space. And then it gets into physics principles of like leverage and force and moment arms. And this is expanded upon in much greater detail in KIN 236 functional anatomy. But we use it here in exercise science because gravity, or manipulation of our environment under gravity, is one of the main ways that we impose stress onto the body to get the physiological responses that we want. And so it can be a little overwhelming at first because of the definitions, because of the terms. It introduces this concept of medical terminology, particularly references within the body. And it really is all about describing skeletal movement, starting position, end position, to be able to analyze that. We're not going to do so much of the analysis here in this class, but we definitely want to get started with looking at things in a three-dimensional space and looking at how we look at this model of the human body and how we divide it up into planes of motion. So are we looking at dividing the body in the left and right half, so movement in the frontal plane versus things in the sagittal plane, or looking at a bird's eye view and looking down at a transverse or horizontal plane. And so just that concept of thinking in a three-dimensional space can be overwhelming. And it's one of those things where it's not a difficult concept to get, it's a difficult concept to make it subconscious. Once this is burned into your subconscious mind, it's very easy to think this way. It takes time. So as you start studying this, don't get frustrated. Realize that it's like learning a foreign language, art, and science all at once. So it can be overwhelming. And the expectation isn't for you to have this down in the next couple days, but it is something you should be working with, and it's stuff that we'll build on as the semester progresses. So what I do for every module, we look at the textbook, because out of all the textbooks I've used, this one is pretty thorough, and it's dense, meaning that there's a lot of information packed into just a few paragraphs of reading, and if you're just looking at it, reading it, you might overlook it. So it's one of those things where I recommend you preview the chapter, watch the lecture video, go back and read the chapter, and then maybe start answering some of those questions. But you definitely need a couple exposures through it in order to extract and be sensitized to all the information that is there. So this is chapter 4. We're looking at biomechanics, and you have the chapter concepts here, but as we go through, this is the main thing here, is this terminology, looking at types of movements, which I talk about in the lecture video, being able to really identify this axis of rotation. So how do I take this pin, right, this single point, this pivot point, and how does that go into the body, and that creates the biomechanical joint, or the axis of rotation that we're able to visualize or realize movement through. And so when we describe that, we're looking at movements that occur in one of these three planes. So you have sagittal plane, frontal plane, transverse plane. To make it even more challenging, and I do it myself, unfortunately, sometimes there's other ways of describing these planes. So sagittal plane is always sagittal plane. But you have frontal plane, which is also called the coronal plane, like crown, because it comes in and crowns the top of the head, I guess. You have the transverse plane, also referred to as the horizontal plane. So sometimes you'll see those interchangeable. Just realize that it's talking about these cardinal planes. When we represent it here, we represent it in this our standard reference point, which is anatomical position. That's legs and arms straight, erect spine, and palms presented forward. And these planes divide the bodies into left and right halves, front and back halves, and top and bottom halves. It's always represented equally right through the center of mass, right in that center point of the body. But this plane can be anywhere. It can be right here at the shoulder, right between the collarbone, right through the foot, right through the hand. So it doesn't have to be exactly midline. It can be a little bit over, a little bit here, and so forth. You are going to spend an extraordinary amount of time looking at these joint actions and looking at what is shoulder flexion versus shoulder extension, what is elbow flexion versus elbow extension. And some of them are pretty straightforward, like elbow flexion, elbow extension. Some of them are a little bit more complex, like horizontal adduction versus internal rotation, or horizontal abduction versus external rotation. So this is stuff that I've talked in the video. I go through in class. The biggest recommendation I can make to you is stand in front of a mirror, read these words and do the movement at the same time. Create a verbal, auditory, and a kinesthetic attachment to it. And I think that's one of the best recommendations that I make for my anatomy classes is to do the movements, do what horizontal adduction and see what that feels like, and maybe touch the body so you can feel the pec muscle coming on, and do shoulder flexion and do wrist pronation and supination, right? Go through the movements and do them, and then see them, right? Look in a mirror and do it, and then better yet, have someone else do it so you can see from different angles and different positions. That's one of the hardest things, and that's the point of what you're not learning this just to memorize this so you can sound smart. What you're really doing is you want to be able to watch someone move and then be able to describe what that movement is, understand what those joint actions are, and then recall what muscles or joints or connective tissues are being involved in that process. So here's lower body, trunk, and spine. And that's it. That's really the first part of that's the hardest part. And you can see that was only 3 pages. There's a lot of information in those 3 pages that takes some time for you to process, digest, and go through. The next part of the book the next part of this chapter gets into understanding force, which is really what we are manipulating as exercise specialists, whether it is for performance or rehab. You are trying to expose the body to things that it's unaccustomed to. You're trying to create micro stresses within the tissue. We're always looking at the Goldilocks principle, and this is something that will come up all the time, is that you have a curve, and if you understimulate, you're going to get no response, and if you overstimulate, you're going to lead into no response and possibly tissue strain and damage. So you're always looking for that just right, that not too hot, not too cold, not too much, not too little. We want to stimulate, but we don't want to annihilate when it comes to adding forces. And so we modulate forces usually by changing the total mass or load, but there's other ways to manage the force, the stress on the tissue, and that's what we'll be talking about a lot. Not so much in this particular unit, maybe a little bit in terms of moment arms and leverage, but definitely when we get into muscle, how can we manipulate the amount of tension or stress that tissue is being exposed to? So we get into the laws of motion, and you can read through this, and I have some stuff on the videos going into more detail. We get into torque, which is probably the most important aspect. Torque is a concept of applying force to a lever that results in rotation. When we look at the human body, all these joints are dealing with rotation, right? Here's the axis of rotation coming straight in, right? You can see that coming right out. That's like if I were to put a pin right there, and that movement is curvilinear or rotational. All human output is linear, so our running, our throwing, our punching, striking, whatever object projectile we're trying to throw off. But it all starts with rotational movement inside. So what this means is that the dumbbell, the weight in your hand, has no bearing on the amount of actual force or load the tissue is being responsible to. So I can take a 25-pound dumbbell and I can hold it out here straight to my side, and I honestly probably couldn't even hold a 25-pound dumbbell that long. But if I put it right up here, I could hold that for hours, right? I'd get bored before I got tired from doing this. But the 25-pound dumbbell didn't change. The weight was the same, and that's because when we're dealing with the human body, we're dealing with torques, right? A force applied to a distance, a lever, if you will, and not actual forces itself. So that's a big concept that we spend a lot of time, we'll do in class, we'll do some activities, but if you're going to read through and if you're going to look up, it's going to be this concept of torque. And, there's some descriptions here. I don't think the textbook does a very good job of explaining it. Like I said, it's dense. It fully covers it, but more details are required. To understand torque, you have to understand lever systems, and lever systems are looking at these balance of forces. And you can have like a balance lever where you have a fulcrum or an axis, and you have the lever, which in the human body, the axis would be the skeleton, the joint, and the lever would be the bone. And then you have a resistance force and a load. And the load is gravity, whatever the mass of that gravity is if you're holding an object, or your body mass. And then the effort is coming from the muscle tension being generated. And there's first class lever, you have second class levers, and you have third class levers. And so you'll read through this. Again, a lot of information condensed in a few pages. If you watch the lecture videos first and then come back and read this, it should make some sense. And then just so you don't freak out, I do have some practice problems where you have to do the math. It's basic multiplication, a little bit of algebra, but it's not my intent for you to do mathematic problems. It's to look at the relationship of the numbers to understand how distance versus speed versus effort changes. And so it's looking at what is the compensation. If I can use a lever system and I can lift a load that's 600 pounds that I normally couldn't lift otherwise, that extra mechanical force is coming from somewhere. I'm yielding something in order to gain that. Conversely, if I'm able to control a huge distance with a little bit of muscle contraction, I'm giving up something for that benefit. So that's all the math is kind of look at some of those relationships. If you half the distance, you double the load and so forth. So just a heads up on the mathematics there. And then I think we stop here. We do look at types of muscle action, but we're not going to look at it in the first unit. I think this is where this stops. You have some of the length tension relationships. Yeah, so we'll revisit chapter 4 when we get into unit 2. But at least for the first part of particularly this muscle control formula, like this is going to be burned into your head. But for unit 1, it's really looking at the first 10 pages. And that's it. That's what unit 1's based off of. So a lot of stuff packed into those 10 pages. Of course, we expand upon it a little bit in the course and lecture, and we'll be practicing a lot of this for this first week. So hopefully this helps, kind of gives you a little guide for our first day of class. We'll be more just introducing the course and kind of getting acclimated to it a little bit, do a little like introductions and a little warm up for this. But you'll be on your own for those lecture videos, for the reading, and hopefully this little video helps. See you soon.